Daniel adjusted his grip on the grocery bags, his arms straining under the weight. His 5-year-old son, Oliver, clung to his free hand, stepping carefully beside him as they made their way across the parking lot. The bags were heavier than usual today. He had stretched every last dollar to stock up on essentials, knowing he couldn't afford another trip for a while. "Daddy, can we have spaghetti tonight?" Oliver asked, his big brown eyes hopeful. Daniel forced a smile. "Yeah, buddy, we got everything we need for it." As they neared their old sedan, a sudden gust of wind knocked one of the grocery bags from Daniel's grip. It hit the asphalt, sending a carton of eggs rolling and a small loaf of bread tumbling toward a parked car. "Ah, no," Daniel muttered, bending down to salvage what he could. Before he could react, an elderly woman nearby stooped down, her frail hands reaching for the scattered groceries. "Here, let me help you," she said, her voice kind but slightly breathless. Daniel hesitated. She looked to be in her late 70s, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a wool hat. She wore a long coat, buttoned up tight against the autumn chill, and her thin frame suggested she wasn't as strong as she once was. "Oh, got it, ma'am. Don't worry about it," he said quickly, not wanting her to strain herself. "Nonsense," she insisted, picking up the bread and dusting it off before placing it back in his bag. "I may be old, but I can still pick up a loaf of bread." Oliver giggled. "You're nice," he said, watching as she handed his dad the last of the groceries. The woman chuckled. "Well, thank you, young man, you're very polite." She looked up at Daniel. "Are you two okay? That was quite a spill." Daniel nodded, adjusting the bags again. "Yeah, just a little clumsy today." She gave him a knowing look, as if she could see past his words. "Well, I'm glad I could help. My name's Eleanor, by the way." "Daniel," he said, offering a small smile, "and this is Oliver." "Nice to meet you both." Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward her own car, a sleek black sedan parked just a few feet away. "Would you mind giving me a hand with my groceries? My arthritis has been acting up today, and could use a bit of help loading them into the trunk." "Of course," Daniel said immediately. He placed his own bags in the back seat of his car before turning to help Eleanor. She had a modest number of bags, but he could see how carrying them all at once would be difficult for someone her age. As he loaded the last of her groceries into the trunk, she smiled warmly. "Thank you, Daniel. It seems we both needed a little help today." "Yeah, I guess so," he said, feeling a bit lighter despite the weight of his worries. Oliver tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, can we say bye to Miss Eleanor?" Daniel chuckled. "Of course." He turned back to the elderly woman. "It was nice meeting you, Eleanor. Take care of yourself, all right." "You too, dear," she said, her gaze lingering on him for a moment. Then, with a small wave, she got into her car and drove off. Daniel watched her go, feeling oddly comforted by the brief encounter. He didn't know why, but something about Eleanor reminded him of the warmth he had been missing in his life lately. As he buckled Oliver into his car seat, his son grinned up at him. "She was really nice, Daddy." "Yeah," Daniel murmured, starting the engine. "She really was." The following week, Daniel found himself at the grocery store again, carefully selecting the cheapest, yet most filling items he could afford. His son, Oliver, walked beside him, humming a tune as he hugged a small box of pasta to his chest. As they reached the checkout line, a familiar voice spoke from behind. "Well, fancy seeing you two here again." Daniel turned to see Eleanor standing there, her small cart filled with neatly arranged items. She was dressed warmly as before, her silver hair tucked beneath a hat. Her sharp eyes, though kind, held a hint of curiosity as she looked at him. "Miss Eleanor," Oliver beamed. "Hello, young man," she greeted with a smile before turning to Daniel. "How have you been?" Daniel shrugged, not wanting to burden her with the truth. "Oh, just keeping busy." Eleanor gave him a knowing look but didn't press. Instead, she glanced at Oliver, who was still clutching the pasta box. "That's a good choice. Are you two making spaghetti again?" Oliver nodded excitedly. "Yup, it's my favorite." She chuckled, a classic meal, simple and comforting. As the cashier rang up Daniel's groceries, he pulled out his worn wallet, calculating every dollar in his head. He was careful with his spending, but even then, it always felt like he was barely keeping his head above water. Eleanor seemed to notice his hesitation because when he finished, she spoke again. "Daniel, do you have a moment? I could use your help with something." He glanced at Oliver, then back at her. "Of course, what do you need?" She smiled. "Well, I have a bit of trouble carrying heavy bags into my house these days. If you don't mind, I'd appreciate some strong arms to help me unload my groceries." Daniel hesitated briefly. He had planned to head straight home, but helping Eleanor wouldn't take long. Besides, she had helped him last time. It was only fair to return the favor. "Sure, we can help," he said finally. Eleanor's house was a short drive away, a charming but modest home with a well-kept yard. Daniel parked in her driveway and stepped out, helping Oliver unbuckle before they both went to retrieve the grocery bags from the trunk of her car. Inside, the house was warm and inviting. The furniture was old but well cared for, the scent of lavender lingering in the air. Family photos lined the shelves, though Daniel noticed that none of them seemed particularly recent. "You can put the bags on the kitchen counter," Eleanor instructed, leading them inside. Daniel did as she asked, and Oliver followed, looking around curiously. "Your house is really nice, Miss Eleanor." "Thank you, dear," she said, chuckling. "Would you two like something to drink? Have tea and some fresh apple juice." Daniel started to decline, but Oliver looked up at him with hopeful eyes, and he sighed with a small smile. "Apple juice would be great, thank you." As Eleanor poured the drinks, she glanced at Daniel. "So, do you mind if I ask what you do for work?" He hesitated before answering. "I do some freelance carpentry when I can get the jobs, but things have been slow. I used to work for a construction company, but they had to let a lot of us go last year." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "That must be difficult, especially with a child to care for." Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It is, but I manage. Oliver is my priority, so I do whatever can to make sure he's okay." Eleanor studied him for a moment before she spoke again. "You know, my late husband was in construction, built half the houses in this town back in his day." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Really?" She nodded. "He always admired hard-working people like yourself. Said that real work, the kind that builds things and fixes what's broken, is what keeps a community alive." Daniel smiled slightly. "Sounds like a smart man." Eleanor's expression softened. I miss him every day." There was a pause before she continued. "You know, I've been needing some work done around the house. Nothing too complicated, just a few things that an old woman like me can't handle anymore. If you're interested, I'd be happy to pay you for your time." Daniel blinked in surprise. "Oh, you don't have to." She held up a hand. "I insist. I'd rather hire someone I trust than a stranger from a company, and besides, it would be nice to have some company now and then." Daniel considered it. He didn't like taking handouts, but this wasn't charity, this was work. Honest work that could help him and Oliver while also helping Eleanor. "All right," he agreed. "I'd be happy to help." Eleanor smiled warmly. "Good, then it's settled." As Daniel finished his drink and gathered Oliver to leave, Eleanor walked them to the door. "Come by tomorrow, and I'll show you what needs fixing." Daniel nodded. "I will, thank you, Eleanor." She patted Oliver's head. "And you, young man, are welcome to tag along anytime." Oliver grinned. "Okay." As they drove home, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Work had been scarce, and while this wasn't a long-term solution, it was something. And for now, something was enough. Daniel showed up at Eleanor's house the next morning as promised, Oliver tagging along beside him. Eleanor greeted them warmly at the door, inviting them inside with the same welcoming energy as before. She led Daniel to the back of the house, pointing out a few repairs that needed attention. The wooden steps leading to the back porch were loose, a cabinet door in the kitchen hung crooked, and the fence along her garden was leaning. None of it was beyond Daniel's skill, but he could tell these small issues had been piling up for a while. "Take your time with it," Eleanor said. "I'm in no rush, and I appreciate any help you're willing to give." Daniel nodded, already making mental notes of how he'd tackle each task. "I'll get started right away." While Daniel worked, Eleanor kept Oliver occupied with small activities. She showed him how to properly water her plants and let him help her knead dough for homemade bread. Every so often, Daniel heard Oliver laughing from the kitchen, and it made him smile. It had been a long time since he'd heard his son sound so carefree. By the time he finished repairing the porch steps, Eleanor had set out lunch for all of them, insisting that Daniel take a break. Though he initially resisted, the smell of fresh bread and warm soup was too tempting to refuse. As they ate, Eleanor asked more about his work. "Do you plan to stick with carpentry, or are you hoping to get back into construction?" Daniel sighed, stirring his soup. Construction was steady, but with so many layoffs, it's hard to find anything long-term. Carpentry is what I'm good at, but finding enough work to pay the bills has been tough. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "My husband always said that good craftsmanship never goes out of style. People always need things built, fixed, and maintained. The challenge is finding the right opportunities." Daniel appreciated her words, but he knew opportunities didn't always come easy. He had spent months searching for steady work, only to come up short time and time again. Still, he was grateful for whatever work he could get. Over the next few weeks, Daniel continued to help Eleanor with various repairs around her house. She paid him fairly for his time, and while it wasn't a fortune, it was enough to help him keep up with bills and groceries. More importantly, Eleanor had become a friend, someone who made both him and Oliver feel welcome. One evening, as he finished fixing the last section of her garden fence, Eleanor stepped outside with a tray of tea. "You've done a wonderful job, Daniel," she said, handing him a cup. "This place feels sturdier already." Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans before accepting the tea with a grateful nod. "I'm just glad I could help." Eleanor hesitated before speaking again. "If you don't mind me asking, do you have any family nearby?" Daniel shook his head. "Not really. My parents passed a few years ago, and Oliver's mom, she left when he was a baby." Eleanor's expression softened. "That must be hard, raising him on your own." Daniel glanced toward the house, where Oliver sat at the kitchen table, coloring in a notebook Eleanor had given him. "It is," he admitted, "but he's a good kid. He makes it all worth it." Eleanor smiled. "He's lucky to have a father who cares so much." Daniel looked down at his tea, unsure how to respond. He didn't always feel like he was doing enough. There were nights he lay awake worrying about money, about Oliver's future, about whether he was making the right choices. But hearing Eleanor say, that brought a small sense of reassurance. As the days passed, Daniel found himself feeling more at ease in Eleanor's home. What started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much more meaningful. One afternoon, as he finished up another small repair, Eleanor sat down across from him with a thoughtful expression. "I have a friend," she said, "a woman I've known for years. She owns a small furniture shop downtown, and she's been looking for a carpenter to help with custom orders." Daniel looked up, his interest piqued. "Really?" Eleanor nodded. "I mentioned you to her, and she said she'd be happy to meet with you, if you're interested, of course." Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. A steady carpentry job? That was exactly what he had been hoping for. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I mean, I don't want to take an opportunity meant for someone else." Eleanor reached over and patted his hand. "You've been working hard, Daniel. You deserve a chance." For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months' hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The next morning, Daniel stood outside the small furniture shop Eleanor had told him about. The wooden sign above the door read, "Maple and Birch Custom Furnishings," and through the large front window, he could see neatly arranged handcrafted tables, chairs, and bookshelves. His palms were slightly sweaty as he adjusted Oliver's hand in his own. "You ready, buddy?" he asked, looking down at his son. Oliver nodded enthusiastically. "Are we going to see the wooden chairs inside?" Daniel chuckled, appreciating Oliver's excitement. "Yeah, we'll see them." He took a deep breath, then pushed open the door. A soft bell chimed overhead, and the scent of polished wood filled the air. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman with short, graying hair and glasses perched on her nose. She looked up from a notebook, eyes warm and observant. "You must be Daniel," she said, setting her pen down. "Eleanor told me you'd be coming by." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said, stepping forward and offering his hand. "It's nice to meet you." She shook his hand firmly. "I'm Margaret. Eleanor speaks very highly of you." Daniel felt a small flush of gratitude. "She's been very kind to me and my son." Margaret glanced down at Oliver, who was peering curiously at a wooden rocking chair nearby. She smiled. "Well, if Eleanor trusts you, that's good enough for me. Why don't we sit down and talk?" Daniel followed her to a small table near the back of the shop, where she had a stack of design sketches laid out. "I've been running this shop for over 20 years, Margaret explained. "We specialize in custom furniture, but finding skilled carpenters who truly care about the craft has been a challenge." Daniel nodded, understanding all too well how difficult it was to find steady work in a specialized trade. "Eleanor mentioned you've done carpentry work for her," Margaret continued. "She also told me how you stepped in to help her with groceries that day and how you've been lending her a hand ever since. That says a lot about your character." Daniel shifted slightly, humbled by Eleanor's faith in him. "I just did what anyone would do." Margaret gave him a knowing look. Not everyone would. She flipped through a few sketches, then passed one to Daniel. "I need someone who can help bring these designs to life. We get custom orders from all over town, and I don't have enough hands to keep up with the demand. If you're interested, I'd like to offer you a position here." Daniel's breath caught. A full-time position. Margaret nodded. "Full-time, steady pay, and room to grow. We start at 22 an hour, and if you prove yourself, there's potential for more." Daniel blinked, hardly believing what he was hearing. That was more than he'd made at his last job. More than enough to finally catch up on bills, to stop worrying about whether he'd have enough for groceries at the end of the month. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret smiled. "Say yes." Daniel let out a shaky breath, then nodded firmly. "Yes, I'd love to take the job." Margaret extended her hand again, and he shook it, still in disbelief. "Good," she said. "You start Monday. Eleanor was right about you, Daniel. You've got good hands and a good heart. That goes a long way in this business." Daniel swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Thank you, really, thank you." Margaret smiled warmly. "No need to thank me, thank Eleanor." Daniel turned, spotting Oliver sitting in the rocking chair, swinging his legs happily. He couldn't help but smile. Things were finally changing. The weight he had been carrying for so long felt just a little lighter, and it had all started with a simple act of kindness. Monday morning arrived with crisp autumn air, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a sense of stability as he walked into maple and birch custom furnishings. Margaret greeted him warmly, showing him around the workshop where finely crafted tables, chairs, and cabinets were in various stages of completion. The scent of fresh cut wood filled the space, and the rhythmic hum of sanders and saws created a steady, comforting backdrop. Daniel was introduced to a few of the other workers, all of whom welcomed him without hesitation. He quickly fell into step, his hands moving with practiced ease as he worked on smoothing out a set of table legs for an upcoming order. By midday, he was fully immersed, enjoying the familiar satisfaction of shaping raw wood into something beautiful and lasting. As the afternoon sun slanted through the shop's large windows, Margaret approached him with a clipboard in hand. She observed his work for a moment before speaking. "You've got a good eye," she said. "Most people rush through sanding, but you're taking your time to get it just right." Daniel glanced up, wiping the sawdust from his hands. "I've always believed that the details make the difference." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what we need here. I think you're going to do well with us." Hearing those words sent a wave of relief through Daniel. This job wasn't just a paycheck, it was a chance to rebuild the life he had been struggling to hold together. At the end of his shift, he picked up Oliver from Eleanor's house, where his son had spent the day. Eleanor had offered to watch him while Daniel worked, and though he had initially hesitated to accept, she had insisted it was no trouble at all. When he arrived, he found Oliver sitting at the kitchen table, carefully arranging wooden blocks into a small house. Eleanor sat nearby, watching with quiet amusement. "You're quite the architect," Daniel said, ruffling his son's hair. Oliver beamed. "Miss Eleanor showed me how to make it strong so it doesn't fall over." Eleanor chuckled. "Can't have a wobbly foundation, now can we?" Daniel smiled, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you for watching him. I hope he wasn't too much trouble." "Not at all," Eleanor said, waving off his concern. "He's been a joy to have around." As they gathered their things to head home, Eleanor reached into a small drawer and pulled out an envelope. She extended it toward Daniel. He frowned slightly. "What's this?" "A little something to help you get settled," she said gently. "Don't argue, just take it." Daniel hesitated, his pride warring with his gratitude, but as he opened the envelope and saw the check inside, his breath caught. It was more than just a small gesture. Eleanor had written him a check for $5,000. His throat tightened. "Eleanor, I can't take this. You've already done so much for us." She gave him a knowing look. "You helped me when you didn't have to, not just with groceries or repairs, but with kindness. This isn't charity, Daniel. It's an investment in someone who deserves a fair shot." Daniel glanced down at Oliver, who was now preoccupied with tying his shoelaces. He thought about the nights spent worrying over bills, the constant stress of making ends meet, and the way Eleanor had quietly stepped into their lives like a guiding light. He swallowed hard, then met Eleanor's gaze. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," she said simply. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, Daniel held Oliver's hand a little tighter. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't walking into uncertainty, he was stepping toward something solid. With a new job, a friend who had shown him kindness when he needed it most, and the knowledge that better days were ahead, Daniel finally felt like he was building a foundation that wouldn't crumble beneath him. And that was more than enough.